Hey, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name's Caroline Lucas. I'm the MP for Brighton Pavilion from the Green Party, and absolutely delighted to welcome you to this session on behalf of Oxfam and Tax Justice UK. And of course, it is Fair Tax Week, and so it's a particularly timely moment to be having this debate. I'm just going to make a few opening remarks, and then I shall introduce your panel, and then we will get properly underway. But I simply wanted to say really just how timely and important this meeting is right now. We know that the climate and environmental breakdown is rapidly accelerating, creating an existential threat to all of us, but with the poorest hit hardest, and those, of course, also being the least responsible for the climate catastrophe. Evidence of its effects are all around us. I'm thinking of the catastrophic drought in East Africa, also the apocalyptic images of toxic smog engulfing New York. Close to home, barely 2 weeks ago, we saw possibly the UK's largest ever wildfire. So I think it's really clear that the UK has to deliver on its share of the changes needed to limit global temperature rise. And in that respect, I just really want to underline something that really matters to me, which is that the whole focus on what's called common but differentiated responsibility, that focus often seems totally absent in debates. But essentially what it means is that those countries that are disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis, who have emitted more than most for longer than most, of which the UK is one, that means that we need to go much further and much faster than net zero by 2050. And yet we're not even on track for that inadequate target. And as well as strengthening government regulation, that also means that we need a huge investment in the green economy, in new technologies, in zero carbon infrastructure. And clearly the tax system has a really significant role to play in raising significant sums of money to support the so-called just transition to net zero and to a more sustainable economy. And I think we need to be really clear about the fact that we can afford what we need to do. We can always afford what we need to do. It is a matter of political will. And it feels even more important to restate that right now, as we see, for example, Labour coming under pressure over its pledge for a £28 billion a year green prosperity plan. Wealth taxes can help us achieve this just transition, and Tax Justice UK have set out 6 wealth tax policies just a little earlier this year that between them could raise around 50 billion a year. And that includes 22 billion a year from between a 1% and 2% tax on super rich individuals who own net assets worth over £10 million. So that kind of tax policy can help fund the UK's transition to net zero in a fair and an equitable way. In other words, asking those with the broadest shoulders, as the government always says, to contribute more. So we have 4 wonderful panelists. They will each speak for between 5 and 7 minutes, which will leave us around 25 minutes for questions and discussion at the end. I'm going to quickly introduce all of them now before handing over to them consecutively. Robert Palmer, Executive Director of Tax Justice UK. Many of you will know, a campaign group who have advocated for a fairer, more effective UK tax system, with a particular focus right now on taxing the wealth of the super rich. Dr. Sara Reis is Deputy Director and Head of Research and Policy at the Women's Budget Group, and she joined them in 2017 and has led research on female poverty, on funding for the women's sector, affordable housing, economic circumstances of migrant women in the UK, the impact of COVID, and the impact of the cost of living crisis. Phil White is a founding member of Patriotic Millionaires, a group of wealthy individuals who campaign for the rich to pay more tax to end extreme wealth inequality. And he's also a supporter of the Green New Deal UK, which advocates for urgent climate and economic interventions from the government. And just in parenthesis, I'm pleased to say that Clive Lewis MP and myself are co-chairs of Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on a Green New Deal as well. And then finally, Jamie Livingstone, head of Oxfam Scotland since 2013, and Jamie leads their advocacy and communications, including on climate action. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Robert Palmer to kick us off. Robert.
Thank you, Caroline, and it's great to see so many people come out to hear about how we need to transform our tax system to deal with the climate crisis. Tax Justice UK is a campaigning organisation. Our aim is to build public and political support for a fairer tax system. We're all about taking really great ideas, really great tax analysis, and thinking about how we can turn it into political reality. Something we've been doing recently is really thinking about how will the tax system have to transform to deal with the climate crisis. As Caroline said, climate and environmental breakdown is rapidly accelerating, creating one of the biggest challenges the world faces. The UK must deliver on its share of changes needed to limit global temperature rises. And as Caroline said, that needs to also take into account historic emissions and the huge wealth inequality that we have here in the UK. We must invest in new technologies and zero carbon infrastructure and strengthen government regulation. In order to do this, the tax system has to be transformed. And I think this needs to be done in a way that is effective, but also brings the public along with it. There is huge amounts of public support here in the UK for action to tackle climate change and the climate crisis. But there is an understandable degree of nervousness about who will pay. And it's really important to ensure that costs are borne fairly, with big companies, the wealthy, and major polluters picking up a larger share of the tab. We need an approach that is just and fair as well as effective. This is both right, and it will be important to get the public buy-in. It's really important that people feel that they themselves won't end up bearing the brunt of the costs in a way that isn't fair. So at Tax Justice UK, we believe that this tax transformation has to happen in three broad ways. The first one, and in some ways maybe the most obvious, is that the tax system needs to raise more money to support a just transition, for example, by taxing the rich and wealthy companies or polluters. This must sit alongside other sources of finance for investment, government borrowing, private sector investment, even individual consumer choice. But it is very likely that the tax system is going to need to raise more money to support a just transition. Secondly, the tax system needs to stop subsidizing behavior that damages the climate and the environment. A really good example is the current set of tax reliefs available to companies extracting oil and gas from the North Sea. It seems bizarre that we're trying, with one hand, to push our economy, to push our system, to push our energy systems towards being more green and more climate friendly, and yet at the same time, the government is handing out huge amounts of subsidies to fossil fuel extraction in the form of tax subsidies. This needs to end. And finally, I think it's important to think about ways in which, in certain circumstances, we can use the tax system to encourage green behavior. Good examples are higher charges on high carbon industries, or using tax incentives to support low carbon behavior. And this needs to be done in a way that is thoughtful and make sure that we don't end up wasting lots of money by funding activity that was already going to happen. I mean, I feel more hopeful about some of this agenda following what's happened in the United States, where President Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included huge amounts of investment in a new green infrastructure and new green energy. Now, like any government intervention, there are definitely problems with it and gaps in it. You know, a lot of the money is going to end up as subsidies and tax subsidies to big companies, but it does show that it is politically possible to rethink how we set up the tax system, to bring in money and to change our tax system in a way that is fair and can support a green and just transition. Now, I want to make sure that I avoid suggesting that transforming the tax system is enough by itself. Tax justice must be accompanied by greater regulation and other forms of investment. There isn't enough attention being paid to this issue at the moment. And at Tax Justice UK, we are planning to build public, media, and political support for transforming our tax system to make it fit for purpose for the challenges that we face. We will work with partners, politicians, and the public to bring this about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That's a fantastic introduction. I failed in one of my duties when I was introducing this session because I forgot to say to everybody, please could you put your questions actually in the Q&A? I know some people have been putting them in the chat, which is fine. It's just that if you're putting them in the chat, we can't upvote them in the same way. Whereas if you didn't mind cutting and pasting and sticking it over into the Q&A, then it just makes life a bit easier when it comes to identifying which questions are most popular and so forth. So please do that. Let me pass over now to Dr. Sara Reis from the Women's Budget Group. Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Tax Justice UK and the Fair Tax Foundation for the invitation to contribute to this discussion on climate change and wealth taxes. So I was asked to speak about these two topics from a gender perspective. So why is tax a feminist issue, and why climate change consequences and therefore its solutions should be gender responsive. So at the Women's Budget Group, we've published our final report on our Feminist Green New Deal project, which we did with the Women's Environmental Network last year. And just this morning, we've launched a brief note on why taxes, and especially wealth taxes, are a feminist issue. But I will start with the climate emergency and the gender aspect of it. So we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and there is a huge body of evidence on this, particularly in the global south. So things like floods, droughts, and other natural disasters, they tend to increase the amount of unpaid housework and care work that is mostly the responsibility of women. And also the displacement and social instability that these events generate, they tend to exacerbate male violence against women and girls as well. And then we have the kind of the perennial issue of women having less resources than their male peers, which means that they're less able to start anew somewhere else or to rebuild their family home after, say, a wildfire or another kind of natural disaster. The disproportionate impacts are also true in the UK. Women face greater barriers to financial security, which in turn make them more vulnerable to the costs of climate change. So these could be things like inflated gas bills, or having primary responsibility for feeding their family as food prices rise because of floods or droughts, or having to pay for repairs after a flood, or being unable to work on days when their children's school is closed because of a heat wave, for instance. So all of these are gendered impacts, and yet the policies that we see usually presented as solutions to prevent and cope with the impacts of climate change, they rarely consider the gendered nature of these impacts. And actually, some of them can even exacerbate gender inequality. So, for instance, when we talk about the need to move into more sustainable practices like using reusable nappies or cooking more home-based food, all of this can actually increase women's unpaid labor. Or when we're talking about creating green job opportunities, new green job opportunities, these tend to be in sectors that are currently very male dominated. And so women may end up being left behind from these job opportunities. So when we're thinking about what kind of green economy we want, it must be one that works for everyone and not simply a greener version of what we currently have, because it is perfectly possible to have a net zero economy that replicates or even exacerbates current inequalities. But that's really not what we want. And that won't also be truly sustainable. And this is because the climate and inequality crises that we have, they have at their root the same economic system that exploits for profit the Earth's resources and its people, especially women and other marginalized groups. So the system relies on care work, paid and unpaid, to produce, feed, clothe, and look after a working population and to keep economies running. And this care work is often invisible, it's undervalued, mostly performed by women, with consequences for women's financial security and health. And this is the same logic that sees, so the same logic that sees this work as inexhaustible and a natural function of being a woman. It sees the earth itself as an infinite source of material, energy, food, and water for consumption and profit. So they go hand in hand. What we want then is a rewiring of our economic system into a green and caring economy. So one that is centered on meeting the needs and ensuring the well-being of people and planet. So an economy that moves away from consumption into better care. And for this, we need robust public services that provide healthcare, care, education, so everyone can survive and thrive. So this labor is all part of what we call social infrastructure, which we need to invest in just as much as we need to invest in physical infrastructure. And this need to invest in both types of infrastructure brings me to the next part of the discussion, which is taxes and the role that they play in how we pay for this transition, how we pay for this green and caring economy. And I think it's really crucial to think about this spending as an investment, because a healthy, cared for, educated population and a protected and thriving planet, they mean a stronger and more stable economy. It means savings on healthcare budgets. It means savings on social security benefits, not having to deal with natural disasters, food scarcity, etc. And at the Women's Budget Group, we've done a lot of research on the return on investment in the care sector, and we found that nearly 3 times as many jobs are created across the economy when you compare the same amount invested in, say, construction, in physical infrastructure. And this includes a bigger contribution to narrowing the gender pay and employment gaps, and also with the bonus that, the care sectors are inherently low carbon sectors because they are labor intensive, but not as much resource intensive. So investment in care is also a greener investment. Because spending on our social infrastructure has huge economic and social benefits, a combination of borrowing and taxation is the appropriate solution. And on taxation, we want a green and caring economy that is funded by a progressive tax system, including and especially relying on wealth taxes, because as Caroline and Robert said, it's only right and fair that those with more contribute more to the common good. And I think particularly it's unacceptable, the situation that we have right now, which is that currently earnings from labor are taxed at a higher rate than income from wealth, like capital gains and other types of income. And wealth itself is barely taxed at all in the UK. Wealth taxes are also a way of narrowing inequalities between rich and poor, but also between women and men. And there are 2 reasons for this. So one reason is that women hold much less wealth than men. So on average, £100,000 less than men, according to the ONS. So wealth taxation works as a form of redistribution. And secondly, and most importantly, it provides funding to public services on which women rely more, where women are the majority of the workforce, and public services which, when they are inadequate or insufficient, women tend to replace them with their own unpaid labor. So funding a green and caring economy, partly through wealth taxes, is also a way of reducing gender inequalities and of securing well-being for everyone.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sara. And thank you just for reminding us that a green transition is every bit as much about care and about the social infrastructure as it is about technology as well. So thank you so much for that. Let me pass you over to now to Phil White from Patriotic Millionaires.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And it's great to have the opportunity to speak on such an important topic and to hear insights from the rest of the panel. Maybe it's worth starting with a shared understanding of what we mean by extreme wealth when we are talking about wealth taxes. because there aren't specific definitions of that. But generally, we're talking about the top 1% of the population. And that in the UK, that's people with more than £3.5 million or thereabouts of individual wealth, maybe £7 million in a couple. And I mean, certainly when we talk to the public, they broadly agree with that kind of definition. So we're not just talking about somebody with a moderately sized house in the southeast who's well off, but we are talking about that extreme wealth, and that's important. And it's also worth noting that actually that top 1% are broadly the class of people that do well regardless of the economy of the country. And they've done well throughout, austerity, Brexit, COVID, and the cost of living crisis. And they are largely immune to actually a lot of the cost of living pressures that other people suffer. And yes, extreme wealth, I do believe, is a problem for climate specifically and more generally. And that's because the wealthy consume more, driving the climate crisis. They drive industry-based behaviors based on profit, driving the climate crisis. Perhaps more importantly, though, they drive this wider growth agenda, which again is really important going forward, what we do on that. And the mere fact that we're talking about extremely wealthy shows that we live in a fractured society, which isn't a good start for solving the sort of problems that affect us all and that we need to work together on. So yeah, consume more, they drive industry behaviors, wider growth agenda, and we get this fracturing in society. On the consumption side, certainly, well, the wealthy are less likely to use shared transport. They fly more often, fly less efficiently in business class, first class, so on, even to private jets, buy more consumer goods with the footprint that those have, larger houses, heated swimming pools, in some cases even having to extend the local electricity grid to power their swimming pools. So they contribute disproportionately to CO2 emissions and other environmental pressures, and that directly affects climate and the biodiversity crisis as well. And that's because when you're wealthy, most things are much easier, and sadly that includes damaging the planet. Another flight here, another ski trip there, whatever. The second point was that they drive industry behaviors based on profit, and that's because firms are largely owned and controlled by the wealthy, and they incentivize managers to drive for higher profits to create more wealth. And we see that in the water companies, where the crisis that we see in our environment is actually water companies actually minimizing expenditure on investment and so on, and some of those still returning profits to shareholders. Oil companies, the same thing in windfall taxes, people's cost of living going up so that oil companies can increase benefits to shareholders. So the wealthy consume more and do emit more disproportionately and drive firms to create wealth, which just perpetuates this cycle, if you like. And that's at the expense of the planet and the people. Thirdly, I mentioned this growth agenda, and the wealthy drive the growth agenda, firstly by advocating growth directly, and secondly, by having a disproportionate share of the outcomes of society and not sharing those proceeds fairly. And that leaves working people dependent on economic growth to get a better standard of living, which again, we saw in COVID and furlough, where actually the furlough payments went in at the bottom of society, filtered their way up to the rich, and there they stayed. And then the rich complained about, well, maybe we'd like this money back in wealth taxes, please. So now, at first sight, growth may not appear to be a climate issue, and we hear all the political parties arguing for growth, but actually it's a really big issue in there. Growth historically has been dependent on fossil fuels. Some people say that green growth is possible, others say it's not, and we talk about whether we can decouple economic growth from fossil fuel usage. And I say different views on that. But I think there's a growing consensus that even if it is possible to get that level of decoupling so we can get growth without fossil fuels, we need to do it much, much faster than we've ever achieved so far. And that puts the whole question in doubt. So growth can't be taken as a given. We need other ways of creating this fairer society, and we need to do that quickly. Now, people facing the cost of living crisis are really struggling. And I think somebody alluded earlier to actually, they tend to be the people that are most badly hit by any kind of policy, if you like, that's meant to be for the common good, most badly hit by austerity and so on. And so this, if you're really struggling with cost of living and you hear stories about climate change, the need to change behaviors and more tax on fuel and so on, that can be quite scary because you don't have the financial resilience to cope with that. So in some ways, it's not surprising that all the political parties argue that growth will solve everything, simply because it's a panacea for actually dealing with the roots of the problem, which is this injustice and this imbalance in wealth and income across society. So I've sort of talked about those economic issues, but also I think on a wider front, I talked about a fractured society earlier. It's not only economically, but socially we see this growing divide in society. People are disillusioned and don't feel that society is working for them. And we see politically the kind of results of that. And democratically, and I see a question in the Q&A, which is probably relevant to this, democratically, extreme wealth has undue power and influence and actually sets the agenda for the UK in so many ways, which makes it difficult to actually deal with wealth practices and so on in the way that we should. So, fractured society, we saw in COVID actually that society can take a lot if we work together. And then we sort of let down by the leaders and the whole Partygate thing and so on, actually undermine that trust and that collective will to work together on this. But the climate emergency in particular, it's not about individuals recycling carrier bags. Only the government can really take the big enough actions that we need in the climate emergency. And so we need the public to support the government and to drive the government to do these things, not to be fighting amongst themselves and pushing the government in different directions. So we need the wealthy to join the fight. I think the phrase was used, those with broadest shoulders should take more of the load. And in Patriotic Millionaires, we're standing up and saying, we want to play our part, we want to help more, and we want to help solve those problems we see in society, and climate's certainly one of those. We can afford to pay more tax to help. We'd be proud to do that, actually, and believe that others like us, other wealthy individuals, should be called on to do the same. We need to address that climate crisis. And when Labour says it hasn't got £28 billion to deal with green investment, we say, come and talk to us, come and tax us. We want to do this, we want to help. So I think, in summary, fundamentally, we need to raise the expectations of the wealthy in working as part of society to solve these things. We shouldn't expect that they take more and more from society simply because they're able to at the expense of the people and the planet. The climate emergency is a problem we all share. We need to share responsibility for solving that. And a good first steps to acknowledge that the wealthy are having a disproportionately negative effect on that, and to expect them to change behaviours and contribute more to solve that problem. So I think taxes on extreme wealth certainly aren't the whole solution, but they can help. Thanks, Caroline.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. Such a refreshing voice in today's political debate. So I just hope your words are heard loudly and clearly throughout the land, because that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to people that they can still put questions in the Q&A box, or indeed upvote existing questions that are there. But now I will turn to our last speaker, Jamie Livingstone, who is head of Oxfam in Scotland.
Thanks, Caroline, and refreshing indeed to hear Phil's comments. I'm going to focus mine in three areas: where the finance gaps exist, the case for tax justice to help fill them, and some of the implications for UK and devolved policy. Now, tax justice has long been core to Oxfam's anti-poverty work, in large part because we see it as a tool to tackle extreme economic inequality. But increasingly, we've been highlighting those links between inequality and climate justice too, because the climate crisis is caused by inequality, it's causing more inequality, and the response to it, unless purposefully designed to be just and equitable, could entrench inequality. And tax justice sits at the very heart of addressing these issues. But firstly, where is more finance needed? Well, there are plenty of gaps in the UK and globally, and together they're delivering a double whammy for communities in low-income countries, a key concern for Oxfam. Blow one is that rich countries' failure to invest in reducing emissions fast enough is fueling severe climate impacts. Blow two is that rich countries are abjectly breaking their promise to provide climate finance to help low-income countries adapt to climate heating, while pursuing clean paths to development that lift people out of poverty. Rich countries are now 3 years late in achieving their self-set goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year. In 2020, they managed only 83 billion. But our analysis shows that when you remove things like repayable loans, the true value is just 1/4 of that. And worse still, we're now seeing climate impacts which are impossible for communities to adapt to, leaving those who did barely anything to drive this crisis facing losses and damages from both rapid onset and slow burn climate disasters. As we speak, the people of southern Malawi are still picking up the pieces from Cyclone Freddy. The Malawian government puts the bill at some $680 million, yet all too often communities are left to bear those costs alone, with women and people of colour impacted the most. A new global loss and damage fund is now being established, but big questions remain as to where the money will come from. But when it comes to limiting the damage, or trying to 1.5 degrees, the UN Secretary General has talked about it requiring a quantum leap in climate action, and that will require huge amounts of finance. Now, here in the UK, emissions are almost half their 1990 levels, but the Committee on Climate Change is clear that the UK government's strategy will not deliver net zero. And relevant today, it is called on it to urgently review its tax strategy to help change that. But instead of doing that, the UK government is rubbing salt in the wounds with a new coal mine and new oil and gas licenses. They should instead, like others, be identifying new and additional sources of finance, because while significant private finance will be needed, public finance needs to lead the way. So why should we turn to tax justice? Well, as we've heard from Phil, not every wealthy person is blind to their responsibility, far from it. But on average, the super rich are supercharging the climate crisis. During the 25 years up to 2015, a critical period in which cumulative emissions doubled, just 63 million people, the richest 1% globally, emitted twice as much as the poorest half of humanity put together. That's 3.1 billion people. But the consumption emissions of the wealthiest are just the tip of the iceberg, because for the very richest people, between 50 and 70% of their emissions are created from their investments. And of course, let's not forget that vast amounts of wealth have been amassed as a direct and indirect consequence of an extractive economic system that has at best turned a blind eye to carbon emissions, or at worst, actively encouraged it. And deep carbon inequality isn't just a global phenomenon. The wealthiest 1% of people in the UK have on average a carbon footprint that's 11 times larger than someone in the poorest half of society. So what does all this mean for public policy? Well, firstly, there's an overwhelming necessity to cut the emissions of the richest before the remaining global carbon budget is squandered. Doing so isn't about the politics of envy, it's about our planet's survival. Secondly, targeting the wealthiest isn't just climate just, it's socially just. Not only have they caused a much greater share of the damage, they also have the greatest capacity to pay. And as we heard from Sara, it's also gender just. So governments, yes, should ramp up their regulation of high polluting activities, particularly of those of wealthy individuals, or by the corporations in which they invest. That means regulating activities that allow excessive emissions, SUVs, private jets, no more oil and gas licenses, raising standards, outright bans, but also applying conditions to public procurement. But while regulation matters, so too does taxation. I'll defer to the tax expertise on the panel, but while of course any tax needs to be effective, it also needs to be fair and popular. And surely on both counts, making polluters pays fit the bill. Later this year, we'll outline some options in the UK, specifically to raise significant new money in ways that make polluters pay while protecting those on the lowest incomes. While not the primary focus, we'll highlight that wealth tax modelling from the likes of the Patriotic Millionaires. Now, some of that huge amounts of money that could be raised is needed for other key areas, tackling poverty, investing in care, reducing hunger globally. But it could certainly help to boost emission reduction in the UK and increase our support to impacted communities globally. And there's also a very strong case for using tax to deter investments in the most harmful economic activities. Indeed, an additional tax rate of 10% on polluting assets owned by billionaires is something proposed by economists like Thomas Piketty and the like. But our paper will focus on new taxes that target high polluting activities that are often the preserve of the wealthiest, a progressively increasing frequent flyer levy, but also taxes on luxury modes of transport, including specifically the use of private jets. We'll model a new automatic tax on excessive fossil fuel profits, rather than scrapping the inadequate UK energy profits levy, as the UK government seems determined to do. We'll explore what could be raised if it was instead converted into a permanent tax on excess profits. Of course, that would also include scrapping the perverse investment allowance that means that oil and gas companies can reduce their tax bill by investing in yet more oil and gas. But as Robert said, it also means redirecting damaging subsidies away from fossil fuel producers. While many of the levers for change sit at Westminster, I'm speaking to you from Edinburgh, and there are important measures the Scottish Government and local government can take too. Despite progress, Scotland's missed 7 out of the last 11 annual emission reduction targets. So we believe the Scottish Government should emerge as a pioneer when it comes to making polluters pay. Now, encouragingly, the new First Minister seems willing to consider wealth taxes, and his Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero says she firmly believes in the polluter pays principle. We think it's time for them to prove it. Research from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland has explored options and concludes that such is the scale of and urgency of the climate crisis, that just like the NHS, the response should primarily be funded from general taxation. So as well as using Scotland's income tax powers more progressively, the research points to replacing the council tax with land, property, or indeed a locally administered and spent wealth tax, all sit within devolved powers. These could be complemented by environmental taxes primarily aimed at changing behaviours. A tax to penalise landowners whose land emits more carbon than it captures. The use of air passenger duty, which is in the process of being devolved. Linking business rates to a firm's carbon footprint and its commitment to climate action. And any money raised from these measures could be and should be reinvested to make the changes we need easier and attractive. We're not naive to think that any of these measures will be easy to introduce. There will be opposition, as we've seen in Scotland in relation to plans for a new bottle deposit return scheme. But when policymakers allow the biggest polluters, often the wealthiest, off the hook, they are choosing to leave low-income communities to foot the bill.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jamie, and thanks to all of our panelists for really provocative opening remarks. I'm just looking at the questions, and maybe actually I will start with the first one from Joan, who asks around, given that all of the arguments that we've just heard over the last half an hour or so are so entirely logical, and given as Phil and Robert said, I think that we are talking, or at least part of us of what we're talking about is the super wealthy, which is just 1% of the population, then why is it that there isn't greater support for this kind of approach as a whole? One can imagine perhaps that certain governments might have certain vested interests at certain times, but nonetheless, it is not something that you hear a massive momentum behind from other people in society. So I just wonder if I could maybe take you very briefly in the same order as we've just had, but why is it that there is so much reluctance to do this, even from people who won't be directly affected themselves, and therefore one would have assumed would be making this call more loudly and clearly than they currently are? Robert, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and part of our job as campaigners is to change that dynamic. If you look at polling, focus groups, there's really significant public support for higher taxes on the wealthy and for closing loopholes. And that's not just people on the left of the political spectrum, but conservatives as well. Whereas if you talk to perhaps MPs, not all MPs, but quite a lot of MPs, there's a nervousness about it. And so I think our job as campaigners is to really build the pressure, show that there's a really wide range of voices that support a more progressive tax system, in part to support a green transition, and build up that political power that really backs the majority of the public who wants to see this. So, you know, something we've been doing since we've been founded 6 years ago is really try and get a wide range of voices out there, get the media interested, and you could already see more discussion of wealth taxation. And actually, if you're interested, any of the people on the session are interested in hearing more, we've got a sort of short weekly newsletter that will do updates on our campaigns that you can sign up to. So I do think that building the pressure is important, but the public is with us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. You know, there is an issue that our political class is largely wealthy, and if you like, understands the whole wealth side of the argument, if you like, and potentially selfish as well, particularly when we look at some members. There is an issue of media. You know, I think if any party proposed a wealth tax, it would be all over the front of the right-wing press, and really generating very, very negative publicity, because the press is largely owned by the right wing, who oppose wealth taxes, owned by the wealthy, non-doms and so on. Interestingly, the Daily Telegraph's up for sale, so maybe we should crowdfund and buy it. I think there is one other point, though, which is when we talk about wealth taxes, we are talking about extreme wealth. There is a little bit of a concern for people that it would then start coming down the track. But, you know, that's just kind of, people worry about these things. So absolutely, I think primarily media and the fact that our political class is pretty wealthy.
I can't help totally agreeing with you. I think crowdfunding to buy the Telegraph might be the biggest thing we could actually do to change the political discourse in this country. But Phil, just before I leave you, I just wanted you to say something maybe as well about the risk of flight. People always say that if you were to levy wealth taxes on the super wealthy, then they'll just simply up sticks and go off somewhere else. How serious is that as a threat, do you think?
I think that's not serious. I mean, inevitably there will be some, but, you know, to be honest, most people here who are involved in the UK are based here, they have families here, whatever, they enjoy living in the UK, and they're likely to stay. There was a statistic around, I think, Norway that said 30 millionaires left Norway because of wealth taxes and went to Switzerland. 30. What it didn't mention was that I think 231,970 chose to stay, because, you know, 30 is not a big number, and frankly, they probably would have gone anyway. I don't see that as an issue, frankly.
Okay, lovely. Sara, any reflections on what you've heard?
Not really anything new to add, just to say that I agree with Rob and Phil's points, particularly about that disconnect between what the public supports and what our political class is pushing for. And so what we need to do is really keep pushing, campaigning and pushing for that pressure to become unavoidable by the political class, so that they need to respond.
And does the Women's Budget Group have a view on inheritance tax particularly? I'm just struck by quite a lot of the questions in the chat are talking about how, you know, making the case for intergenerational justice is potentially something that could have more leverage. And I'm just struck that James, for example, is asking whether or not tax justice support raising the base level of inheritance tax. We can come back to Robert on that in a second, but there are some more general questions just about whether or not changing the system of inheritance tax would perhaps have more traction. I don't know if that's something, Sara, that the Women's Budget Group have looked at.
We haven't looked specifically at inheritance tax, but what we are really in favor is of a review of our tax system, and to make sure that you know, it is made more progressive, and that will inevitably lead to, you know, taxing wealth much more than it is right now, taxing income from wealth much more than it is right now, and that it's fair, particularly compared with how we tax earnings from labor at the moment. So yes, well, I think what we need is really that sort of overall look at the tax system, and to make sure that it is progressive and fair.
Lovely, thank you. Jamie.
Look, taxes aren't as popular as they should be. But part of I was really struck by Phil's point, and he's absolutely right, because inequality is skewing our politics. If you lined up the voting public, then the average voter in the middle would be significantly better off than the average person in our population as a whole. And therefore, there's an incentive for our politics to be skewed towards policy making that appeals to that higher income average voter, rather than the lower income average voter across the UK. I'm quite optimistic, though, in some respects. I think there's certainly in Scotland, and it perhaps feels more optimistic at times here in terms of some of our trajectory of politics. But I think the public finance necessity that is being faced is forcing people to look at options that perhaps were deemed not politically palatable previously, including wealth taxes. And also when you look at things like, Scotland set up a climate assembly, 100 representative people to talk about some of the solutions. And the solutions they came up with were significantly more radical, including wealth taxation, including making polluters pay taxation, than most of the political parties are offering. So I think there is a change going on. I think there is a disconnect going on. And I think people are waking up to the necessity that if we want to have good public services that value and invest in care, absolutely agree with Sarah's points on that, whilst tackling child poverty, whilst tackling the climate emergency, then really we need to significantly raise new revenue, and tax has to play a bigger role in achieving that.
Thank you. I can't help just pointing out in parenthesis that the Green Party does indeed have a wealth tax policy. There's a lovely thing in the chat from David Haslam saying, I think it was Mark Steele who produced the badges about the wealthy leaving the country, which said, "I'll drive you to the airport." He used to have one until he lost it, but that's nice. I wanted to come back to Robert on this issue of inheritance tax, and I'm interested that we've got Jerry Jackson in the room, who was indeed once a tax inspector, and he points out that an inheritance tax could collect huge amounts of money, but there are a whole range of disproportionately beneficial reliefs that benefit the rich, and I'm pretty sure that changes to inheritance tax was one of the proposals in the six proposals from Tax Justice UK. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, thank you. So inheritance tax is one of the few taxes that we actually have on wealth at the moment. And I think it's first important to say that I really support the idea of taxing, giving huge amounts of assets or significant assets down the generations. I do think it's important, because if we don't, we just further entrench inequality. And we have a situation where people can only buy a house or get on in life financially if they have had the luck of being born to wealthy parents or wealthy families. So I think that principle is really important. And, we've talked a lot about what tax does, but tax is one of the glues that bind us together. At the same time, our current inheritance tax system is broken. It's mostly paid by sort of upper middle class families with quite expensive homes. If you're really rich, there are loads of different loopholes that you can use to avoid it. You can, for example, invest in AIM listed shares on one of the junior stock markets in London. You can pass your pension pot on to your children inheritance tax free. So there are lots of ways in which we need to close the loopholes and make sure that the really wealthy are paying their fair share. But I do think it is important that as campaigners and politicians, we do stand up and defend inheritance tax and the principle behind inheritance tax, while making the case that it needs to be reformed. And we actually put out a blog earlier this week, very timely, on inheritance tax, the facts behind inheritance tax, and why we need to be making the case. There are real, concerning rumours that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are looking at reducing or scrapping inheritance tax, which, whatever you think about the tax, strikes me as a particularly bonkers priority when millions of people around the country are struggling to pay their bills, and come winter will be struggling to heat their homes.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Phil, did you want to?
I was saying absolutely, just completely double down on Robert's comments. Why do we have this thing? I mean, personally, yes, it does hit people on moderate incomes. If it was going to me, I would probably raise that bottom threshold, but then make it cut in more seriously, make it much more progressive, and take out all the loopholes. At the end of the day, you can't take it with you.
No, indeed not. I wanted to come to, quite a lot of people are raising land value taxation or a green land tax and so forth, and asking whether or not consideration has been given to our proposals around a wealth tax instead of a land value tax, or could it work in combination with it? I don't know, Jamie, if that's something you can speak to first, and I'll come back to the others.
Look, the issue of a land value tax has come up in Scotland quite a lot because of the debate around reforming and finally trying to replace the regressive council tax. And it's got stuck in the weeds for so long, and then people circle back and say, but what about this land value tax? And that's because there's huge land concentration, particularly in Scotland. And when you look at where wealth exists, most of that is bound up in land and property. So we need to try to tap into that in some ways. So certainly looking at things like land value taxation as an alternative for the council tax in Scotland is one of the key policy recommendations coming out of the Stop Climate Chaos research, but also trying to build that and explore that alongside the potential for local wealth taxes. There are some restrictions at Scotland level on a national wealth tax, but at local level, as long as the revenues are raised and spent locally, including on climate action, there is no barrier to exploring local wealth taxes that effectively add up to a national wealth tax in Scotland. So land value tax certainly is something that we'd like to see explored.
Lovely. Anybody else want to come in on that one? If not, I can go to another one there's quite a technical one here, at least it feels technical to me, from Francisca Marga, who says that her question is about the distinction between a tax on wealth that's measured by consumption or investments. We know the data that we have is sparse in terms of estimating the size of emissions related to both, but especially investments. How do you think we should prioritise this going forward? For example, should we have more research to get a better idea of the full picture, a focus on public education, that investments also matter rather than consumption alone? Should we perhaps refocus on showing the feasibility of wealth taxes of both types? I don't know if Phil, that's one to come to you with first.
Sure. I think this is really important. And I mentioned earlier that the climate crisis is not going to be solved by people recycling carrier bags. And, you know, there's a tendency by governments to blame consumption, blame the consumers for things that are happening. And okay, we're all consumers, we're all contributing to this, but we can't solve the problem. The problem that has to be solved by government at national level, at international level, at global level, and so on. And it has to be solved by big business investing less in bad behaviors. And so, yes, I think we absolutely need to focus on investment, and we need to focus probably on investment more than we do on consumption in many ways, because, you know, I can reduce my carbon emissions by 5%, 10%, or whatever I do, and 50, 60 million people in the country could do the same thing. But at a stroke of a pen, the government could do much, much more than that. And so that's where the big action comes in. I think we need to highlight the role of investment in this. We need to highlight the role of the banks, which, you know, organizations like Client Earth, like Just Stop Oil and so on do very effectively. And we need to put much more light on that.
Thank you.
Caroline, just to share some research that we did in November specifically on this, and it wasn't easy because all the data isn't readily available, but we looked at companies in which a billionaire owned a stake of 10% or more, the sort of level at which investors have a significant influence over a company's operations. And we found that the investments of 125 out of the world's 220 richest billionaires generated about the same emissions as France. And so when you co-locate that with consumption-based emissions, we added those together, and effectively what we found was that each billionaire, their emissions were more than 1 million times higher than someone in the bottom 90% of humanity, 1 billion times higher. So we need to turn the attention on investments alongside consumption. But for me, it's around looking at where we can break the impasse on some of this and go to where some of the most egregious examples of climate injustice are. And that means reaching for things that are fairly straightforward, that are going to elicit public support. Things like frequent flyer levies that are progressive. Things like looking at additional rates of air passenger duty on private jet use. I think I think there's broad public support, or there would be, for those sorts of measures which start to move us towards an approach that starts to use our tax system that actually does target those that have caused the crisis.
Lovely, thank you. We're beginning to come towards the end of our time. I've got a quick question for Robert before then giving everybody a minute to answer another question I'm going to give you. But the quick one for Robert, and it sounds very specific, but John Danderson says, is the value of a house included in being a millionaire? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but maybe it could lead into a very quick reflection on where you do put the threshold when you're talking about wealth taxes. I know we've talked a lot about the 1%, but what about those people who are millionaires technically, but who don't have that as liquid assets?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When we look at wealth across the country, most wealth is held in people's homes and their pension pots. That's like 80% of wealth in this country. We want to see an annual wealth tax with a threshold of £10 million. So you're talking about a very small number of very, very rich people. There are only 22,000 of those in the UK. But I would say, I think if you own £1 million house, in my book, that does mean that you are, you do have more wealth than most people in this country. And so I think it's important that we find ways for everyone to contribute fairly, and that people with similar amounts of wealth are contributing in similar ways. And so that does mean that we need to close loopholes and understand it. But I can also appreciate that if you have £1 million house in London, perhaps that feels less wealthy than if you have £1 million house somewhere else. But I can definitely say from the perspective of my generation, I know that myself and my friends would love to be able to at some point have £1 million house, but it feels pretty unlikely at the moment given our current economy.
Thank you. Okay, so listen, we are really running out of time now, but I was just noticing there are quite a few questions that sort of reflect on both what can we do and sometimes talking about the voting system and how do we actually get more of a majority of people in power who actually would agree with us on some of this. But also, for example, I was just looking at, and forgive me for a bit of special pleading, but Nick Morfitt, a Green Party councillor in a Conservative-dominated unitary authority, asking how can I most effectively use my position to push for wealth taxes? So if we kind of take that question about how can people generally, given that they're on this call, presumably because they do care about generating more momentum behind this debate, maybe just 1 minute each from all of you about what can people do to try and drive this issue further up the political agenda. And I'm going to come to Sara first.
I suppose one simple way is really to push your MP to let them know about these surveys that show that an overwhelming percentage of the population supports wealth taxes. Show them that the political opinion is on their side, and also be confident in pushing for that and knowing that, again, the majority of the population support you. And so this will need to be something that politicians take on. So maybe that's the more basic action that could be done by all of us.
Lovely, thank you. Jamie, just 1 minute.
So I think ultimately it's best to start where politicians are at, and they're focused on the cost of living crisis, and we need to position things like wealth taxes and progressive taxation not as at odds to tackling the cost of living crisis, but as a means of doing so. So it's about the overall package of raising finance progressively and investing it in ways that both reduce the climate emissions in the UK and support those on the lowest income. So identifying those win-wins, but starting where policymakers are most focused, the cost of living crisis.
Lovely, thank you. And can I just quickly draw people's attention to a link in the chat, which is to a tax justice link that takes you to their website, where you can email your MP about wealth taxes, and the template is already there for you. That was posted at 12:58. Phil, your last minute.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess my comments on that was politicians need to make the change, but we have to remember that politicians need to be elected. And actually, they do run scared of the public in many cases. If they don't have that public support, they can do nothing effectively. So I would say what we can all do, and what your Green councillor can do, is actually put public pressure, do this heavy lifting for politicians to help change public opinion and give them permission, if you like, to tax the wealthy more significantly. Caroline, with due respect, I think probably the next government might be a Labour-led one. Yeah. So actually, particularly, we need to put pressure on the Labour Party to do this. So share Facebook, webinars, anything you can do, crowdfund the Telegraph purchase.
Thank you. And last word to Robert.
Yeah, there's lots of great suggestions. You can sign up to our newsletter to find more. We have lots of different actions, including writing to your MP. I think the crucial thing is we need to bridge that difference between the support you see when you ask the public about wealth taxes and where MPs and politicians are. So keeping the conversation going, building pressure, arming ourselves with the right arguments, understanding that actually the very wealthy don't pay that much tax. You know, there are people who pay lots of income tax, but if you're really wealthy, you're not paying that much tax. And we need to continue to make the case that there's lots of reasons for a transformed tax system, including dealing with our current climate and environmental breakdown that we've been talking about today. So I feel cautiously optimistic given the progress we've made, but there's so much more to do.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you all so much for those presentations. Thank you to everybody who's joined us for this discussion. Apologies to those people whose questions I couldn't reach. Quite a lot of ones came in towards the very end, just as we were running out of time, but it really shows there's a real appetite for this debate. I think lots more questions coming up about pensions, about more details around the inheritance tax and the issue of a lower limit. So let's have another one where we can discuss some of these things again. But in the meantime, thank you all so much, and have a good rest of your days. Thank you.